I think we all agree that there's no doubt that the acquisition and analysis of huge data sets is really transforming the way we do science and the way that centers like NERSC are operating. Our first speaker, David Skinner, is getting wired up here, really has been a pioneer in integrating data-producing facilities into NERSC in sharing data and analysis capabilities through the web. David's currently the strategic partnerships leader at NERSC, and he's going to tell us some of the opportunities and challenges in extreme data science. So let's welcome David.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome, NUG members. So for any of you who were at supercomputing this last year, you heard a talk called, more than likely heard a talk by Kathy Yellick called More Data, More Science, Moore's Law. And this was a very interesting, thought-provoking talk that Kathy gave at supercomputing that unveiled some of the first real, what I would call, substantive directions about what are we going to do in data. And let me apologize first by saying that data is not a very descriptive term. I understand it means numbers. And for different people here in the audience, that probably means different things. So we concatenate a lot of meaning into this one word data, but you know, it can be how you are gathering the data, how you are logistically managing the data, how you're analyzing the data, how you're curating the data, how you're making the data do great science after you're done with it. So those are all sort of things that, as you look at these slides, try to take a broad view of data if you can. And my enthusiasm in this area is really centered around the science, so I'll be talking a little bit about that. And the part that I will leave out in lieu of more expert voices in the area is Moore's Law. I'll talk about it a little bit, but I'm not going to give any pronouncements about where computing technology overall is headed. So NERSC's strategy is a real simple one, and sometimes simple guiding principles are really what make an organization excel. And internally, staff and other decisions that are made within NERSC really come back to this real simple sort of criteria for where should we go, what should we do. And we're at a time now in people's generation of data, storage of data, data policies that are coming from different areas that we really are asking those sorts of questions again about, okay, what's the next step? What are the sorts of activities that we should continue, and what are the sorts of activities that we need to grow into? Keeping all of you, NERSC users, our user community satisfied and productive is really at the core of that. And after many discussions and a lot of thinking and input from requirements reviews and other community processes, where we're going as a center really comes down to these 2 points: is continuing to increase application capability and the various prefixes that we use to describe what a big computer is shift over time, and currently we're calling that usable exascale. So exascale machines are within sight, and we want to make sure that they work for you. The second area is simulation and data analysis, and extreme scale data analysis is the second of 2 major thrusts in the current NERSC strategic plan. And I'll be talking about those right now. I wanted to give kind of a macro view. This isn't a NERSC slide, so don't attribute this to NERSC's design. This is from a community report that was called the Scientific Collaboration for Extreme Scale Science. And you see in here, let's see, where's the laser? Some familiar things: computing facilities, down here. Storage, these are sort of bread and butter topics for NERSC overall. But in the overall ecosystem of collaborative science and research, these are parts of a lot of different resources that coexist and at different strata, sort of at the the physical layer of facilities, at the kind of middleware layer of things that join different science projects together. And then these higher level knowledge seeking and collaborative environments that are really tremendously important to scientists. So in taking in this whole ecosystem here, I think it's really important for resource providers, for centers, for all of you, to take a broad view of this and to figure out how can we make these components work together really well? The idea of a computing facility as a standalone entity that you would, take your punch cards to and show up at the computing facility, run your computation. That activity is less and less, a separate activity from other things. And in many cases, it's less and less a specialized activity. That is, that there are increasing ways that we can sort of stitch scientific data and stitch scientific computing into an overall workflow that can move discovery faster. So the last slide was sort of a community view on this. This is more from NERSC's view. These are some speeds and feeds from science topics and projects that are currently active within NERSC, broken out. The only thing worse than the term data in terms of describing things is probably big data, but we'll use that. And this slide is meant to sketch out kind of what we mean by that. We mean data that comes in volume, data that moves very fast, data that comes in a lot of different types, and data that needs to be checked or that has holes or gaps or errors in it, right? And these permeate the scientific and programmatic concerns that NERSC has, and there's some drivers here that are pushing this into directions that make it a concern that all of us need to really begin to ponder in terms of strategy. So the top 15 science projects that are sort of data heavy at NERSC are broken out here. Our term for these are projects. A lot of times these are actually experiments or initiatives, other sort of community things. Anybody here who here has a project directory? Okay, so in some sense, people at NERSC are able to think of all of these things as being in a project directory someplace, and that's what we mean. And all of these have project directories, but they come from very, very different places. And that diversity has been a real strength of NERSC going back a long time, is that we're kind of the place where a lot of the nation's science data across wide science disciplines meets, and best practices can be shared. In the most optimistic case, we can actually do some really cool data fusion in bringing data together from different areas and come up with new discoveries. So these are some of the current big drivers, and they come from all over the place. And if you work at NERSC nowadays, one of the things you spend some time thinking about is, how does this all fit together? The other motivating slide, I have a couple more in terms of where are we at now, just has to do with reckoning the growth rates that we're seeing with detectors and sequencers. And this slide compares those to where CPUs and memory are going. So if we want to keep the end-to-end process of big team science moving, we need to avoid pileups. We need to avoid impedance mismatches where the detector can't talk to the processor and so on. So very specifically, and there's some technology trends that we can get into that sort of are behind that last slide overall, but technology trends don't mean a whole lot if they're something that came and went and hey, I never dealt with it. So I myself barely ever dealt with CUDA. I've sort of dodged the CUDA bullet in some ways, but there's some bullets that you can't dodge, and this is one, which is the amount of data that comes across our border every day. So every blue dot is a day. There are high bandwidth days and low bandwidth days, but over the course of decades, the trend in exponential increase in data movement is quite clear. And I like that because it tells us, maybe where we'll be in 2016 if things continue the way they are right now. So the traffic is driven really by automated data pipelines, large-scale processing from genomics, Large Hadron Collider, increasingly image processing. So why image processing? Well, telescopes, microscopes, light sources, all these things, in essence, are cameras of one sort or another, and they generate large amounts of image data. Data comes here. I like to think, at least, I'm open to feedback from other people, certainly, because NERSC is a secure, reliable, fast, open, and flexible place for scientific data. We've done a really good job keeping out of the crypto card business thus far, and a whole bunch of other little things like that put together mean that scientists can get their work done easier and faster. So let's take a look at kind of where this is coming from. So I told you a little bit about where we are at NERSC, what people at NERSC are thinking about, those sorts of things. We're driven by what happens out in the community. And this is a picture of a light source. And I leave it to you to decide whether this is the light source of today or the light source of tomorrow. In actuality, it's sort of both. If you go over to the ALS, there are some people with new cameras, very ambitious data strategies overall. There's some people who will abide perfectly well for a long time without having to reboot their thinking around data. And that's fine. And that's also something that NERSC is really accustomed to. We have such a broad user base overall that we're not trying to corral everybody into the same direction to get on the bleeding edge or things like that. We, as you know, support Fortran and lots of things that have been around for a long time. So, a portfolio approach is good. So for some people, this is tomorrow. For some people, this is why didn't we start planning this 5 years ago? And so this cycle really starts with these detectors. And detectors that are CCDs are on a super Moore's law data ascent. There's a need to reduce this data, to provide features and information in situ. This process sort of drives even faster when robots begin to move samples, that we have automation, high throughput strategies for surveying samples. All that data that's generated needs to come into the computational tools and analysis that are done to compare data, to simulate data, to corroborate it, and ultimately into these stages here of managing and sharing data. That could be within a team to larger teams, and ultimately making these facilities a secure, integrated, real-time, and sort of programmable resource. So it used to be sort of far-flung a little bit to manage somebody using a computer and a light source and ESNet all together at the same time, and that was a sort of heroic act of scheduling and getting your right allocation at the right time. I think it's useful to think about that sort of model of an integrated fabric of DOE facilities as a potential target to shoot for. Our users are certainly asking, how come I can't use this and this? And I want a piece of NERSC and I want a piece of this, and I want to be able to assemble these all together to power my science agenda. So in some sense, this is real simple. If you want to complete that whole loop there, you just put data on the web, right? And this is an example from Kathy of actually of how my kids do research for their homework and things like that. Is if you want to learn about something, you just go to Google and you put in the name, and sure enough, knowledge, one could imagine, pops up on the screen. In this sort of farcical example, looking for antineutrinos.jpg, lots of data comes up. And some of that data might be interesting, but this is not quite at the level of world-class science. So let's look at some ways that we can do a little bit more than just Google for things. So some of these new data methods that are certainly in discussion from requirements reviews and a lot of other discussions. And in fact, I mentioned that part of the reason that not everybody's here is because they're off talking about these things, in DC and other places. So you can read as much or as little of this as you want. I hope you find a few things in there that you find interesting or relevant to you. It's not exhaustive, but my main intent in having such a verbose set of words there is just to get across that this is not a question of how many disks to buy, right? This is not a storage capacity issue that says, we just need a certain amount of storage and then we'll store all the data. People want to do really interesting things with the data. They want to do things like deep search, where you could ask genuinely, genuinely interesting scientific questions about data, sort of in their native format, and get answers from them. There's a whole bunch more here as well that we'll sort of get into. But this massive pile of requests, will surely get kind of winnowed down over time as we recognize which technologies really work well, which ones maybe we can forego. And it sort of seems to me the right time for the community to be asking, how do they see these new data methods being delivered? Is this a collection of tools, or is this a collection of APIs, or is it both? And certainly some of the R&D efforts that I've seen before in high-performance computing have had kind of a tools middleware type of approach. And it's not clear to me that a single big monolithic tool or a collection of panelized tools is going to be able to address this wide collection of things. And one of those reasons is that a lot of the computing that people want to get done and the data analysis that people want to get done, they don't necessarily even want to see. They want that to happen automatically in the background, part of a workflow. They want the answer. They want to be able to make good scientific decisions or achieve scientific insight through knowledge that's delivered to them from data. So where we are right now, at least, is in a space where there's, I think, over 220 now scientific data and computing application programming interfaces that are written in a sort of modern RESTful format. You can go to some of these URLs to find them. And so whether it's access to data, access to services, a lot of these sorts of things are becoming available through programmatic ways, which feeds exactly into what I was talking about earlier about, build your own science capability using the resources that you want from different facilities. APIs are a great way to do that. So I wanted to tie this into simulation. I'll kind of bounce between simulation and data as if they were separate topics a little bit. And this is a imagined modern scientific workflow from the Scientific Computing for Extreme Scale Collaboration, Scientific Collaboration for Extreme Scale Science report that came out. And this is the S3D. It's written a little small up there, but if you know S3D and GTC, this is sort of their workflow. And there are a lot of technology components that are called out here as to where storage and distributed computing, where data analytics happens and things like that. But it's broken into these sort of two streams of post-processing and in situ. Post-processing is really nothing new to a lot of us and to folks at NERSC. We've always made queues or other sort of spaces available for people who need to stream through data and do analysis on it. The most important thing I think about in situ processing is that it's no different than post-processing. It's just earlier, right? And so part of what we're working at here is to move these tools and processes that used to happen after the fact to build them in. So there are a variety of reasons you might want to do that. Probably the most compelling one is just time to solution. If you had to go run your simulation, wait for the results, get the results, go post-process them on another job and back out. There are only a certain number of times that you might do that before it's less interesting to do it, and you'd rather have a kind of in situ view to that. So bringing in situ processing and post-processing together requires a lot of the tools and data methods that I described on the last slide. And you might, if you're a software design thinker or motivated to kind of look at this overall workflow and figure out, well, how do these parts fit in? Who are the stakeholders in the different components, and where do they come together? So this is a animated rendition of a similar workflow, but here motivated in beamline science, where there's a data pipeline that moves data to storage and computing, that has a prompt analysis component that allows people very quickly to be able to run the simulations and to bring simulations and measurement together to compare them. So this is, not far in the future if you're doing small angle X-ray scattering at the ALS. That you need simulations that to overlay on your curve sort of before you're done doing the experiment. And so the speed with which we can drive this cycle is crucially important to that sort of beamline science. So the last two parts of the talk are on data science and some wrap up about kind of overall questions at NERSC. This is from Kathy's supercomputing talk, and I was not at supercomputing this year, so it's my rendition of it. But the excitement that I think a lot of the community has right now about transforming how we interact with data and what we're able to get out of it falls into this broad class of data science. And extreme is always better than mundane or whatever. So extreme data science is very much part of what we're interested in. So these new models of discovery, at least in a technological sense, involve being able to reuse and analyze previously collected data, to simulate with new models, discover relationships across data sets. This is one area where this has been going on for a long time, but I think the interesting example here is quasi-crystals, for which a Nobel Prize was given some time ago. The person who discovered aperiodic tilings in quasi-crystals was staring at the electron micrograph and saw something that they weren't able to kind of fit together into their point group symmetry knowledge. That's something that you could detect across large amounts of data. And so being able to discover relationships across data sets with mathematical analyses has tremendous upside potential overall, given the amount of things that people have discovered simply by happening to stare sort of at the right micrograph at the right time. Being able to fuse data together from other disciplines, this is not a new phenomenon, certainly overall, but big data in the commercial sense is really brought together statistics and computing together to be able to do this in a way which is much, much faster than had happened a lot of times before. And that's mentioned here with machine learning. So one of the goals of this model of discovery with machine learning is to take what would be a postdoc or a substantial human-invested research activity, that is, go do principal component analysis or support vector machine or random forest on this data, come back and report what you found. Both in the private sector and in scientific research, the idea of building such models in a scalable, automated way through machine learning is not going to replace the postdoc or the graduate student or anything like that, but it may allow everybody to move further faster by getting those models generated without a manual process. So this is a good example of that. This is, if your job is to count cyclones or storms in a large climate data set, you might use visual inspection to go through and say, hey, I know what a storm looks like. I'll go through and find how many storms there were, and we can count those up and graph them over time. Well, it turns out they're pretty good mathematical descriptions of what the vorticity in a storm looks like and things like that. So being able to, instead of retrieve this data, have some sort of manual or partially manual process to count those things up can be replaced by analysis that's moved to the data, and that counting, the counting of storms or other features in the data is automated. The storms also finding kind of the inherent structure in data. That is, that if energy or in this case mass is being convected along particular routes within a system, sometimes it's easier to think about those routes than it is about every single mesh point in the entire sample. So this is really about machine learning. Here, another unifying abstraction that comes across a lot of these projects that are at NERSC that are working with data in new ways is what I might call radical scaling. It's by that I mean just doing data fusion and reconciling data that comes from very, very different spatial, temporal, or domain areas. And these aren't ordered in chronological order, but Genomes to Life certainly had this viewpoint a long time ago. Let's take sequences and make them useful to biology. KBase is very much involved in that sort of activity right now, building models on genomics data. Microbes to Biomes has a few different goals, but I think the most concretely stated one that I've heard is to study the microbial biome around plants in the same way that the human microbial biome has recently been mapped, and looking at all the different critters that live on and in people, is to be able to do that for plants. This frontiers approach in energy intensity and the cosmic frontier in HEP is a bridging across very, very disparate scales problem. Being able to automatically analyze image data, to move from pixels to models, which then feed back into these sorts of activities. And this is a very generalized description of what's happening at a lot of light sources and other places, which is, if I have a machine that can take a lot of high-resolution images of a system that's difficult to image? How can I take many, many such images that maybe contain unknown variables such as rotation or other things, and bring all those together to make one very, very accurate or structural or high-resolution model? So in the diffract and destroy experiments that are done down at Stanford nowadays, they drop macromolecular machines through a very powerful laser that lights them up and destroys them at the same time. And all of those samples are at some arbitrary, rotation. So their rotation in space is not known. And you get a little bit of diffraction out of each one. But this sort of process here is taking lots and lots of such images and building a single unified model. I'll talk a little bit about this beamline to browser scale is really looking at how do we connect very, very fast data instruments to commodity data instruments, laptops, things like that. How can I work with terabytes of data that comes from a light source effectively in a remote way? Being able to couple data from some of the world's best climate models down to solve regional problems. And lastly, in the materials genome, both of these topics we'll hear about later today. In the materials genome, has this sort of initial goal of replacing materials design with search, be able to computationally survey vast expanses of possible materials, and then answer questions that are design focused by searching through them all. This is getting sort of moving from the supercell level up to slightly larger levels where things like batteries are being considered and engineered materials for sunlight to fuels. Moving from materials to machines, this means going up from defects to functional electronic materials to nano and mesoscale phenomena. So there's a lot of upward possibility in these things, and one of the unifying aspects of how we see scientists working with data is being able to accommodate really radical shifts in scaling. And here's some of the tools that we're talking about and we're hearing about from user requirements in the data space overall. This one's sort of a no-brainer. Big, fast file systems. Those have been at computing centers for a long time. Powerful, flexible computing. All manner of advanced analysis, machine learning, things that allow us to organize data better, things that allow us to move data better, and overall sort of an end-to-end focus in scientific workflows. So in the variety and veracity part of the data slide that I showed before, I thought this is an interesting example that is one of the science gateways that runs from NERSC is Ameriflux. They have these towers that are collecting wide variety of environmental, ecological, climate data that are have a wide variety of sensors on them, and these sensors marshal their data to NERSC and other locations where they're organized and analyzed. And I'm not a climate scientist. There are very specific prefigured questions that are built into the Ameriflux agenda about things that they want to measure, carbon and things like that. But we have lots of examples of really amazing scientific discovery that comes from the organization and analysis of data that is not necessarily obvious where it's going. So in this case, people trying to look at the noise signal in one of their antennas, took an approach where they began a real systematic analysis of that noise to figure out where it's coming from, what it's about, and all that. And they ended up telling us something about the overall structure of the universe. So I'm tremendously optimistic that sensor data combined with simulation data, combined with the capability to organize and analyze that data, has big upsides. Being able to reuse and reanalyze previously collected data is another cross-cutting theme in these projects. You could take all the data you want and file it away on a big pile of disks or tape archive someplace, but it gets a lot more interesting when people can interrogate that data in ways that drive their own research. So the Materials Genome Initiative and their kind of Spearpoint project, which is called the Materials Project, has been in the news quite a bit recently, and I've already already described it a little bit, but I think that some of the key things that are not necessarily obvious unless you kind of come at it from a computing center perspective are about durability of data and curation of data. That is, taking an active view in a project about how is this data going to be used later, how can we maximize its impact and people's ability to leverage it. So who in here has heard of a data management plan? A few people, yeah. So think about reuse and reanalysis and things like that when it comes to data management plans. There are new requirements on scientists about what they should plan to do with their data. And for a lot of you, that means that you'll be writing data management plans in your grant proposals and things like that. And I just want to point out that, keeping the data in case somebody wants it, and gosh, they're going to have to email me and then we'll figure out what to do with it. That's better than throwing the data away, and it's probably better for your funding agency too. But building in a plan to reuse and reanalyze the data is tremendously tremendously more forward-looking in terms of what can be done with all this data. Multimodality is another area that merits concern, and NERSC is a great place to look at multimodality because we have such a breadth of science users and science topics. This example that Kathy gave is from brain. People looking at the structure of the brain, and there's quite a bit of activity in this through the brain initiative that President Obama announced. But the brain is a big, complicated thing, and it'll take people some time to figure it out, I'm sure. One of the routes toward that is looking at data that comes from different modes of interrogation. And an example that I'm a little bit more familiar with compared to work in brain and neurology is in bioimaging. And so if you take one sample and you're able to assay it in 2 or 3 different ways, the process of taking those different assays, which may not be even registerable or directly comparable initially, and being able to overlay them so you get multiple modes of data at every point or object is a tremendously interesting direction for data science. So to give you a kind of big picture view of this, sort of zooming out from NERSC concerns overall, is that there are people within the Office of Science looking at advancing scientific knowledge discovery, and we hear about knowledge systems a little bit through K-base and things like that. But this really is a broad area. We'll probably be talking more about data than knowledge for quite a long time, but I want to connect this sort of up a level to what people are doing with that data. And so this is a collection of activities that I'm hoping that the NERSC users in the audience can kind of take in and look at how they might leverage them. If you see areas that you think are sorely lacking, there's still time to influence some of these discussions and agendas too. So if you're familiar with Materials Project and K-base and some of these other things, you'll see that really attention to end-to-end scientific processes, doing what we can with human-computer interaction. This is a tough bullet point in particular for scientists who are not all that well known for making sleek, intuitive interfaces overall. But there's a lot of work to be done there if we want to move the data that we're collecting into this sort of picture of being able to inform decisions. And so, from a resourcing perspective, we have computing resources, simulation data, instruments, and data analytic appliances. Maybe these two are the same thing, actually. But in this whole process, being able to discover, analyze, present, and then deliver back knowledge to scientists is sort of the big picture goal here. So how do we get there? I'll tell you first, I don't know, but it's really fun being in discussions about with this topic about people who are trying to figure it out. And I think just in the last year in particular, we've made a tremendous amount of progress. So these are some of the puzzle pieces as they come together here for extreme data science. And there are a lot of components in here that you're probably familiar with. The one that I want to talk about today is sort of about how do we get there in terms of facilities. So this is I should have underlined concept, but this is a concept that, that Kathy presented at Supercomputing last year. There are other concepts that are out there too that don't have this XDSF name, but we're all sort of imagining what sort of resources and capabilities would drive this. There was an interesting set of slides that came back from DC yesterday where there were some discussions going on, and the technical term that was used in some of the slides there was the data thingy. So, you know, put on your algebra hat here and just consider this to be a variable, you know, that stands for something. But it's something that we already know a little bit, you know, a facility that can handle the data that comes from the Large Hadron Collider, that can handle the data that comes from the Joint Genome Institute, that can handle the data from ALS, from these different sources, you know, is something that there's quite a track record on already. And so, you know, the question is, if we look at where detectors and data trajectories are going, is this sort of the right model for the future? What can we learn from the models that are that exist right now in order to inform where we go from there? If you apply for time at NERSC, you can get you know, computing time. You can get an allocation of disk. You know, you can sign up for various other smaller things, but it's really about computing time, mostly overall. And part of XDSF is broadening that to include data services, storage and analytics, and network services, which I'll describe a little bit now. And the outer context for this is really about data science, computer science, mathematics, and machine learning. And there's lots of software engineering that's part of this as well. The science partnerships, which I'm excited to be involved in now, is not a huge leap away from what a lot of you might know at NERSC already, as NERSC tries to provide excellent user service and to work with PIs on making NERSC effective for them. You know, partnerships are in some sense an abstraction of that or a generalization of that towards objectives of program offices, of experiments, of projects, and also in the private sector. So the component on here I haven't talked about yet, so I included one slide, is scientific data, software-defined networking, which comes out of ESNet. And, you know, I don't think there's anything in ERCAP right now other than, do you need to do data transfer over the WAN, that we really ask about. But you know, in this sort of future space that we're imagining, you know, asking the network to do a lot more than just be there is kind of what this comes down to. And so adaptation, increasing flexibility, and really pushing the limits of what networking technology can do is imagined to happen, in this case, by making some of those choices available in software. Right now you have very little choice at all about how the network works. It's either there or it's not. The changing space of applications is really brought out here, is that, you know, in order to get there, you know, we need to expand our thinking, you know, to include both these 7 giants of data and 7 dwarves of simulation. The giants here are a reference to the National Academy's report on frontiers in massive data analysis. And these are not fully unknown things to us. I mean, we know a lot of these from existing science applications, but we certainly don't have the depth in how we represent scientific workloads through benchmarks and through proxies and things like that, and that needs to be developed. The data structures that we use too, I mean, the kind of bread and butter of NERSC in some ways is the you know, MPI, OpenMP, Fortran C, Python, you know, those sorts of things. The level at which we interact with the data, in many cases, doesn't need to be at that kind of bare metal sort of level. And so, you know, software and workflows that allow us to kind of move up a level can be really useful. And so FastBit and FastQuery from John Wu and Ari Shoshone and other folks in the scientific data management group have allowed scientists to kind of stop messing with their data as much. Is maybe one way to look at it, is that they can ask queries against the data without having to get down into the data sort of at a shell level, file level, that sort of thing. So this is a tremendously powerful tool to be able to interact with data using data structures that are not the flat files that are written out of a simulation or that come from an experiment. Tigris from Deb's group is moving in the direction of scientific workflows that abstract concurrency and parallelism and other things sort of behind the scenes. I think of this sort of like MATLAB or other interfaces that allow you to say that you want to do something, and then behind the scenes it figures out what sort of resources are needed to do that and what sort of parallelism are required to do it. There's an R service, a parallel R and SciDB service at NERSC that have become increasingly popular as well. And so these are all data structures, algorithms, and interfaces to data that allow people to work with larger and larger data sets. There are going to be a lot of technology choices ahead as well. And this is a slide from Kathy that compares compute-intensive architecture and data-intensive architecture that I will not go through fully, but looking at these kind of core concepts here of maximizing the bandwidth density near computing versus bringing more storage capacity near the compute or embedding the compute into the storage are different tasks that have different technology, optima in terms of how to deliver data to them. And this comes down to sort of memory technologies, how dense are the sockets, to some degree, although we have limited ability to control it, what type of CPUs are available. There are other areas where we have a lot of choice in terms of, how we allocate a computing resource like Edison or Hopper in terms of how many login nodes are there. I heard somebody say on a call Friday that they wished that Hopper had 100 login nodes. And I was like, why do you want 100 login nodes? So we can do 100 streams, to it. And so these are the sorts of things that I don't think Hopper's going to have 100 login nodes, first of all. But, those login nodes, having more conduits and more pipes to a machine like Hopper is something that we can treat through, for instance, the network connectivity of the batch nodes and other ideas like that. So designing our own CPUs is considerably harder, but there's tremendous flexibility in a lot of other areas about how we adjust NERSC resources to really drive data-intensive architectures. This is a bit more of a political or social question in some ways, which is how do you want to see big computers used? And I think everyone would say that they want to see them used well. And to some people, well means they should be busy all the time. And as some of you know, and anybody who doesn't, I'd ask you to think about is sort of the balance between having resources available when you or your scientific workflow needs them, compared to having them, fully utilized all the time. So we're exploring and examining these trade-offs about how interactivity can work. One of the secrets to NERSC's success, I think overall, has been thus far pretty good isolation between all these different users. That when you get a node or your batch job, in as much as we can, is more isolated, from others. And so your performance expectations, the kind of error situations that you can reach, all of those things are less wild and woolly, than they are maybe at some other computing centers. But perhaps for data-heavy workloads, that sort of model is one that we can put aside, and we can do more sort of collaborative resource scheduling overall. So the last thing I want to touch on is how this is all programmed, and this is really Kathy's passion overall is how are we going to which programming models are going to excel at delivering on these sorts of challenges. And again, rather than declare a winner or give you my own advice about this, I'd say that the answer is obvious. It's probably both, and NERSC is heavily involved with both at this point. If you are somebody who wants to make sure that these technologies are persistently and indefinitely available as they are, come to NUG and tell us about it. If you want to, if you want to help NERSC position itself for more advanced computing technologies. Come talk with us about that too. So the last two slides I want to show is just to kind of recap some of the data science, and computing connections that we have are really, concepts that are beginning to think across these boundaries in quite a bit more level of integration between detector network and computing. And these are really important if the mission goals of some of the detectors that are being built out there are going to be satisfied, is to be able to have that kind of end-to-end science happen very quickly and to be very very user focused. And in addition to that, innovating in the simulation side, we'll be hearing later today about the materials project in detail. This example is really all about data flow. How do we get data and analysis across? The data-driven simulation perspective is really one that doesn't have to start in big data, but it generates durable data that people can reuse. And so one of the key points here is if you want to make your own materials project in whatever field you're in, some of the guiding principles aren't that complicated, is look at collaborative HPC workflows that produce web-based durable data assets. And if you have an algorithm that can produce those, if you need a team of scientists collaborating through some social mechanism to do that, there are a lot of ways to get there, but we have great collaborative potential in data by bringing those resources together in a way that they're not just living in your home directory or your project directory, but they become resources for the larger community. So the two directions in terms of data science and computing that I'll leave you with, are really summed up in our strategic plan, that are these two planks about usable exascale and extreme scale data analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Any quick questions?
Could you give us an example of how the data could be changed using FastBit and FastTrack?
Oh yeah, so FastBit is a word-aligned database, if you want. So let's say you have a big cube of data, 3 dimensions, and at every point in the cube you have a few different chemical species, the temperature, the pressure, maybe the velocity or something like that. And you have a question which is like one of these kind of deep search questions that you're not able to ask Google, which is what's the surface area of the layers that have a temperature between X and Y and a carbon monoxide concentration between P and Q, right? So if you throw away all the data points that don't match that, you might be interested in the surface area of that kind of subselection overall, or its volume or other things. And so those indices, things that you might be interested in, like pressure, temperature, carbon monoxide concentration, those things can be given to FastBit, and indices can be pre-computed that the queries that are done after the fact become very, very fast. So you can talk to John Wu right over here if you want to learn more. Yeah?
I guess since we're talking about 40 years of NERSC, I thought I'd make a comment that I was on this users group meeting maybe 20 years ago, and at that time we were told that NERSC had the world's largest write once, read never file systems, because 90% of the data that was written was never read. I mean, this is primarily, I think, because it was a backup, essentially. But time seems to have changed a lot, hasn't it?
They really have, and I'll be the first to admit that I was slow to pick up on it. That I got into computing because I was interested in fast simulation, and for a long time I was glad that the backups were there and the file systems worked and stuff like that. But it is really a paradigmatic shift, to see people starting with data, where many papers that are written now, are opportunistic reanalyses of existing data. And so rather than starting with, writing your Fortran code to simulate the thing you want to simulate, the data is integral to that.
Okay, thank you, David.
Sure.